Nancy.
I call this meeting of the Northeast Independent School District to order. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present, that this meeting has been duly called, and that notice of this meeting has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. Item 2, the time is 5:31. Item 2, 2021 Legislative Agenda Workshop. Ms. Caldwell.
Good evening, Madam President, members of the board, Dr. Micah, executive staff, and guests. Tonight, I bring you an opportunity to review some of the key points we talked about at our earlier meeting this month, and for you to have time to work on the board legislative agenda for 2021. So tonight's work is to develop priorities for that agenda, possible topics as a reminder that we discussed earlier in the month at the public board meeting, school finance, accountability and assessment, digital learning. Those are all big items that I anticipate legislators will talk about in the session. And then you've had local control on your agenda in the past, and then a general other category. So this is a recap of the priorities that the board adopted for 2019. The check marks indicate that something was accomplished toward that goal. I'm being generous with the check mark. So, for example, fund schools adequately by accurately reflecting the cost of education and regularly adjusting to changes in cost. House Bill 3 does not include any inflationary cost ability, but it certainly did a lot of things in recognizing the cost of education, particularly for student groups, right? We increased the special education allotment. We received the dyslexia allotment, early childhood, compensatory education change to try to recognize tiers of poverty. So House Bill 3 certainly did try to reflect the cost of education. Do we still have more work to do in Texas? Of course. But I'm giving that a check mark because it really was a landmark bill that got us moving in the right direction. Investing current revenue dedicated to education without a reduction. That means that everything raised through property taxes should go back to public education, meaning that the state needs to not use that toward other purposes. Studying recapture. Now, certainly House Bill 3 pushed recapture down the way and made some changes to recapture. We probably, as a system, will need to reinvest some time in discussing that recapture system. I don't think 2021 is really going to have a lot of appetite for that because it is pushed off several years, but I think that that is still something that needs to be done as a state. And oppose programs that divert public tax dollars to run schools that are privately, run. I give this a check mark because we did not have anything passed last session, but I don't want to give the impression that the work is done. Any kind of education savings account bill, any kind of voucher bill can always come back. Accountability, adjusting it to make sure it accurately reflects what we want to measure our schools and our districts on. We have not achieved that yet as a state. Adopting individual graduation committees. That's something that the legislature has been doing incrementally. So the first time this went into effect was 2017. It was going to expire in 2019. So then they reauthorized it in 2019 for another 2 years. So it actually is set to expire in 2023. So I give that a check mark because we're good for the 21 session, and it's something that we as school districts are allowed to use. Funding SAT and ACT test administration, we got that. Districts are receiving a one-time reimbursement for the cost of administering one college entrance exam per eligible student in the spring of their junior year, or their senior year if they don't take it that junior year. So we were able to be successful in that priority. Local control, you had some items related to that. Notice and information about charter school expansion. We still are getting limited information as a school district when a charter is either wanting to open as a brand new charter operator or an existing charter wanting to expand. For example, we might get a general reference that it will be located in Northeast San Antonio. Well, is that us? Is that Judson? Is that who is that? Where is that? So we still have some work to do when it comes to transparency on that process. We certainly do have a little bit gained there. The state has created a statewide charter application process and a statewide waiting list. So that gives us greater transparency as a state into the demand for charter schools. So that's going to be helpful moving forward. But we still just don't even know geographic saturation and locations at the time of application. And that's some work to be done there. You as a school board having the flexibility to respond to local safety, security, mental health needs, I give that a check mark because we certainly did make some gains there. We as a school district now receive a safety allotment that does provide flexibility. In other words, it's not just an allotment that is used for one thing like hardening of schools. We can use it for quite a bit of things, which is what we had asked for. We didn't want the legislature to dictate that we had to have metal detectors or have to have a certain item in our program. We wanted it to best meet the needs of our campuses and our kids, and we were able to get that through that safety allotment that we receive. The criminal background checks for school board candidates, this is a resolution that y'all have sent to TASB. It also has been on the district's legislative agenda. During the 2019 session, they did clarify in a certain Senate bill what qualifies as a felony. So we did get some better qualification on those charges and what would disqualify someone for a school board member. But we don't have a statewide criminal background check. Now, you as a school board certainly have that in your board operating guidelines, and we implement that at the candidate application process. We have candidates complete the district's volunteer check. So as you are thinking and doing your work tonight, some sources for you to consider that may help you in framing the discussion, these were included in your packet. The TASB priorities and resolutions, the TASA, Texas Association of School Administrators, positions and priorities. The Texas PTA recently put out their legislative priorities. The Bexar County Education Coalition is a new group that Northeast is involved with. This is a membership of 15 Bexar County school districts coming together around priorities that we can all get behind. That's in your packet as well. And then in your packet last month, and then again earlier this month, and then again this month, this meeting, we have those information submissions that the district made to the House Public Education Committee on accountability, school finance, and the digital learning environment. So those are some things to draw from, to draw language from, to draw thoughts from as you do your work tonight. So I provided some sentence stems to get you started to think about. These are very brief intentionally, just to get the conversation moving. In a legislative agenda, you would have a more fleshed out sentence with a supporting talking point. In the past, I've also developed one-page white papers on each topic to provide deeper information to the legislators. This is, again, just something to get your juices flowing tonight as you do your workshop. Protect the Foundation School Program. We want to make sure that if the state is facing that budget shortfall I talked with you about earlier in the month, that they don't sacrifice our basic school funding to do something else. At the end of last session, we knew that House Bill 3 was going to increase in cost over the years. And remember, when House Bill 3 passed, that was dependent upon $50 a barrel of gasoline. You know, we lately have been between $39 to $40 per barrel. So even when the House adopted that bill unanimously, several members of the House spoke about needing to come back to the table and talk about revenue in the future. The sustainability of House Bill 3, even back then, was in question. And now we have an economic downturn that certainly brings that sustainability into question. That's something to think about. There are potentially parts of House Bill 3 that we could delay as a state implementing. Things that haven't fully gone into effect yet, that have big price tags, that we could put pause on. We're not going to remove it from law. We're not going to say that it's not a valuable piece of our school finance system, but we could pause it. And the state does have precedents for that. We have facilities allotment funds that over the years have been funded and not funded. And that is something that the state has always had, that facilities allotment available. They don't take it out of code, for example, but they just don't fund it all the time. And that is something that they could do with certain elements of the House Bill 3 funding system, rather than cutting that basic allotment, which is the cost of every child before all the other layers and weights are added to it. As an example, the teacher incentive allotment could potentially be something that is paused. Not every school district has implemented that yet, and it's a hefty price tag for that piece of House Bill 3. We could put a pause on that for those cohorts who have not started yet. So you're not hurting anybody who's already in the system, but you're just also potentially not using that funds. It's a cost avoidance, really, versus a savings. We also are seeking potentially flexibility on spending requirements. Given the uncertainty that we have been facing since March, it's been difficult to spend all the funds exactly as the legislature has asked us to spend them. I'll give you an example. The bilingual allotment was increased in House Bill 3 to recognize the best practice of dual language, but also to recognize that the dual language process is more expensive. Well, what makes dual language programs more expensive is because you have extra teachers in those classrooms. But the bilingual allotment cannot be used to fund teachers. So the state recognizes it's more cost. They recognize that the reason for the cost driver is the teachers, but we can't use the funding for teachers. So that is an example of some flexibility that could be granted right now, again, as a temporary flexibility, just while we are in these uncertain times, uncertain economic times, and school districts are having to respond to unexpected needs. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we always just have to be cognizant of programs that would take public tax dollars to invest in privately run schools. Again, some proposed accountability priorities for your thought tonight. We have the potential as a state to pause, reflect, and recalibrate on accountability. We can collect data, learn from where we are right now in this pandemic world we're in, use that as baseline data. Don't use it to promote kids. Don't use it to put sanctions on schools or districts. Use it as information. Recalibrate. Why are we trying to measure kids on a past reality? Let's create a new reality for accountability. Nobody knows yet what that learning loss can be. Across the country, researchers are trying to predict that based off of hurricanes, closures, other disruptions to education. But we've never quite had a disruption like this before. So we don't know what that learning loss long-term is going to look like. And a potential thing for you to consider is asking for a recalibration to let us build upon the success we've already had, the gains we've already made, and let's make this system what we've always wanted it to be. Now is the time to do that. We also need the system to have greater differentiation between D and F ratings. Now, we certainly are never saying that a D rating is what we achieve for, but the sanctions for a school that's rated a D should not be similar or the same as a school that's rated an F. Those campuses need to have that opportunity to raise out of that D. And we think that the sanctions should be different, as in the law it is written as different ratings. It's not A, B, C, and F, it's A, B, C, D, and F. And F is failing. So we need to, as a state, our accountability system needs to recognize the differentiation of those. In thinking of some other things you might want to consider and what we talked about earlier in the month with the digital divide, I group these as COVID-19 pandemic priorities. Instead of calling them digital divide or mental wellness, there's an opportunity to talk as a school system of things that we need in response to the pandemic we're in. We talked about last time the digital divide and the attention that the legislators might have on that topic. We have the opportunity to shape the conversation about what is internet. We talked about that earlier in the month. How can we improve how we use as school districts the technology and instructional materials allotment, which has been around for a while, but is it meeting our needs? Is it efficiently meeting our needs given today's world? Can we, as a state, encourage policies and programs that help to address trauma-informed care and the impact of the pandemic on a child's wellness? One of my concerns is mental health was such a big priority last session. I worry that there will be some who think we took care of mental health, and we did some amazing things. We have training for staff now. There's a mental health consortium of resources coming together. There's a lot of things that we did gain last session. But the mental health conversation last session was, again, not the trauma of a pandemic world. It was just recognizing that students and families needed some supports. So what does that support look like now as kids are in trauma? We know that there's going to be a lasting impact of mental health on our children in this world. We know that calls are up. Domestic violence calls are up 13 to 15% here in our local area. And we even know that even in families who are not making those domestic calls, it still is stressful. There still are feelings happening, right? Kids are feeling isolated if they're in virtual learning. Mom and dad might be stressed of having the kids home. Mom and dad might be stressed sending them to school. Cases happening. There's a lot of trauma happening even in what we would consider stable families or stable households. How are we as a state going to encourage policies that address that? Mrs. Williams at our meeting earlier in the month talked about the TASB discussion related to racial diversity. I thought that this might be something y'all would want to talk about tonight in thinking about how a school district can make an impact, particularly. I came back to the classroom. If we invested in programs that strengthen the pipeline of minority teachers in the classroom to better reflect the student population in Texas, we can make great strides in having that sensitivity in our classrooms that's needed. And I do have just some statistics here to show you why it is needed. When you look at state level data, and this is available through the TEA website, so it's 2018, 2019, our teachers are not reflecting the student population. We are not seeing a diverse teaching population as we have a diverse student population in Texas. And of course, we know that Texas demographics have changed. In 1991, 1992 school year, 34% of Texas school children were Hispanic. Today, we're closer to 53%. At that same year, Texas teachers were 77% white. So we certainly have gained some minority teachers, but we still have a long way to go. On a local control topic, you've had the transparency item I reviewed earlier on your 2019 agenda. I did change that a bit. It was revised from that 2019 to get more specific in the type of notice that we're seeking, along with an impact analysis of what that charter moving into that community would do. And an impact analysis could include state funding impact, as well as the impact of revenue to the community schools. Again, these are all proposed. These are all thought starters for you. This is all something to get you going and to get your juices flowing. So really the rest of the workshop is for you to have that discussion so that I can come back in November and bring you a legislative agenda based off of your preferences.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was taking notes. So would someone like to, I made a couple of notes of things that I would like to see on there, but I usually go last. So I was gonna, do we want to just?
Thank you so much. That was informative, and I forgot, I feel like I remember remember, and I see, you just informed us, Dr. Micah, not just you, but your staff, and you kept us in the loop and with the changes, and I feel like we were right with House Bill 3, and so I understood everything you were talking about, and I could see it, I could see the programs, and could see where the programs were lacking, and so I just wanted to thank you before we started, and I'm so glad that you took the time to meet today, because I can't imagine having just said, let's pick something 2 weeks ago and move on with it. I think this is really important, and it's important that we're here to take the time to come up with some great ideas. All right,
So would you like to start?
I just did.
I can start. I can.
You would like to start?
Sure.
Okay.
I just, one of the things that we, when we had talked with Joaquin Castro, us three, and then you were on that call too, one of the things that I remember Ms. Winkley saying that was very important was that, that internet is like water and gas, like it should be readily available, and so this shutdown and the virus really, showed what we don't have, like what kids don't have, right? And so that really struck a chord with Sandy and also with myself, and I'm sure everyone on that call agreed, is that we tried to work really fast, and we did a really good job in this district of working fast to provide, hotspots and where kids can go, but it really put us on a very fast, we had to really think fast, and all of you guys were amazing in that process, right? But I also, am I on?
Yes.
Okay, I thought it was off. But I also think that there's a bigger picture. And just because we were faced with a lockdown and a virus, we're going to come out of this. We don't know when, but we will come out of it. And we cannot let that slide by. I don't think so. I think that we need to pursue it. That's in my opinion, because it's important. And we've always, which leads me to the next one that the bullet point is about instructional and technology and instructional materials. We've always, many school districts have always talked for years that we need to go one-to-one, right? And then here we are with the lockdown, and we're not one-to-one, right? And so it really put us in a very difficult situation. It put our students and families in a difficult situation. And again, as a district, I think we worked super fast, and we're still working fast. And I know that there's still things coming in because there's a whole back order of technology in this country right now. But I don't think, because when we get out of this pandemic, I don't think that we should still talk about it and get something done, because I think it's important for our kids to do that. And we have kids in our district that whose parents don't have the resources to go out and get a device, and it's more evident right now that they need it. So I just think those two things are really are poignant during this time and will be going forward. And I also think that, I think the publishing companies, and we talked about this before, eventually they're going to go digital, and there's going to be no more hardcover books anymore. That's what they are I think are going to be committed to in the next 10 years, I think. But that's going to be here fast. And so I think, getting these devices 101 is going to even help us out when those publishing companies decide, when we start adopting new textbooks that are not going to be. And they are like that right now. I know that there's some textbooks that are not textbooks anymore. I think a lot of the specialty elective courses, some of them are like that. I know that they are for some in music. But there are already some that are not, they don't have there's no book. There is just online. And so I throwing that out there for discussion or to make it maybe perhaps a priority. Those are my kind of thoughts on those things.
Mr. Leos. So it's interesting you picked up on the connectivity piece. So you all remember I sit on Operation Connectivity for the state. And so we actually had 2 meetings today, one with the city and one with the state. And so the city is going to try to connect. What they've done is identify about 40 to 50 geographic areas in the city that really have very little access to internet. And so they're going to provide internet access for it. But the thing is it's for a period of time, and then it lapses, right? The state with Operation Connectivity, yet again, what they're wanting us to do is identify kids that are low socioeconomics, that don't have it, and then, get them, and the state's going to, look, there are 5.3 million public school students in the state. They're willing to do it for 150 to 200,000.
Oh.
So if you can just look, that's, and the thing is both plans, and again, I understand what they're trying to go for, but I think what this proved over time is that internet isn't just because of COVID, right? Then we talk about the learning loss that's going to happen through this pandemic, and kids are still going to need connected. They're going to need to be connected. They're going to need access to resources. What we've seen is the ability to now connect kids across a virtual platform, but when they don't have internet access anymore, what's that going to do, right? So I think that's a great one to focus in on. There is a lot of conversation both locally at the state and at the national level. So I think you're going to hear that being talked about is how are we really going to solve that digital divide?
Dr. Mike, are we talking about supplying the devices or beefing up the network infrastructure? Because and this doesn't really affect, I don't think, us at Northeast ISD, but
Your mic,
let me
Tony.
give you,
Move it toward your mouth.
Yeah.
let me give you, for example, I saw a story on the news the other day about a family in, I guess they were in South Bear County, and this family received a device, received a hotspot, but it just so happens that where they were located happened to be in a dead zone. So there was this constant rebuffering, and as soon as the kid would get halfway through an assignment, it would, cut out, and, and I don't know what program they were using, but anyway, you'd have to kind of start this process again. And so it was this, constant, or, something that might take normally 30 minutes was taking them maybe an hour, hour and a half, just because of this. And so that's what because devices are important too, don't get me wrong, but where the state, and I don't know how the state helps, I'm definitely talking out of my area of expertise, but, where the state might be able to help, beef up that infrastructure so that it's just, like you said, it's uniform, almost like you'd go in, the Water Development Board would lay down water and sewer pipes to
Right.
Is something like that, is that what you're talking about?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I
No,
just
go.
wanted to kind of echo what Mr. Hassel said, is that you are very correct. You're very extremely dead on about that. I work on the south side, and if you ever make it over there, our cellular service on the south side is absolutely terrible. It's terrible. I could be in my office and I can tell you what time of day that cell phone service goes down. So I know, do not call me, do not make calls, don't even text because I can't even get a text in. But our schools, our neighborhoods, I can go home every day and get cell phone service, right? But our kids in that side of town, they're stuck there. And so when we're providing these hotspots, that's great. But then the infrastructure is not there. So, and I think it's like this bigger picture also as well. And I would also hope that, we can do in education all we can and work with our legislators all we can. But I also think somehow, these corporations need to be brought to the table too, because they're the ones that are going to need to help us get the infrastructure and get the devices. And we provide so much for these corporations, and that's great, and we use them. But I think somehow they also need to be a part of this conversation as well.
And Mr. Hasso, or I'm sorry, Mr. Leos. I was thinking of Mr. Hasso's question. That's exactly what we need from our legislators here in Texas. It is a conversation with providers to tackle some of this. So like today's call that Dan and I and Tom and Doretta were on with the city is they're talking about, potentially using or needing access to school buildings in order to put up antennas, in order to broadcast it out, right? But then it becomes this issue of, so let's put a designated line into a home, right? Well, there's a piece of equipment. Who owns that piece of equipment? What happens? Because sometimes you have a high transient family. So now that piece of equipment goes missing. Who's on the hook for that, right? Like there are a lot of pieces in it. And one of those, again, with this state being so large, is that you're right. You take your local example, but now let's go out to West Texas, right? The Panhandle, some of those places where are very rural, you even have more of a problem. So it's a huge undertaking, but it's going to take at a national level with these providers to start saying, how can you help with this? How do you lay the infrastructure? How do you get it in, and then figuring out the layers as to how to build a very reliable system? Because again, if you'll remember, when this all started, the question was, do you have access? And they were, oh yeah, I do, but it was the phone, and it's not very high speed, and it's not very reliable. So then it comes down to, even again, you got to kind of dig down as to what's the standard that's needed to operate the things that you're doing, right? So it's a heavy lift, but it's one I think that's definitely worth discussion.
Well, I couldn't agree more, because I think there's, really what this pandemic, I think, highlighted too, is just the possibilities of going online. And I know in every case it's not perfect, but, we just started. I mean, 5 years, 10 years down the road, I mean, who knows what online learning from a traditional ISD can look like. And there's so many advantages. Again, I can remember when I was a kid with acute asthma, I was, easily a week and a half each year, I'd be homesick. And just being able to now boot up a laptop, it makes a world of difference that you don't have to truly be out. Just like we can work from home when we're feeling a little under the weather, don't want to go in and get our coworkers sick, we can still be productive. And I think, with this, maybe students can too.
Okay, I'm sorry, but in the essence of time, because we have till 6:30, I think we've kind of talked about that this might be one that we're interested in. So I want to know if there's something in another category.
So
wait.
So just to clarify,
Okay.
so that I can make sure I bring back to you what you want, are we keeping those two first bullets related to digital connectivity and the instructional materials allotment? Are those, is that what I'm hearing, that we're talking about those two first bullets?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think for sure the first one.
Okay.
So tell me how this would work, Deb. If we kind of narrow it down, but then we might need to narrow it again. Does that?
Yes, I think that there's potentially more here than what you would want to
Right.
adopt. I would suggest that you keep the legislative agenda as laser focused as possible on really your big asks, realizing that it's not the end all. We can still support bills, we can still advocate for information, but this is what you as a board of trustees is stamping as your priorities. It doesn't mean that there's aren't others, it's just this is your top tier. We want these legislative priorities. So that would be,
So kind of, I'm envisioning as we work through this, we might have those two bullets, but then when it comes down to really the final one, it may only be one of those.
I could potentially merge them as well. These two could very much be merged into one. I think I can.
Yeah, it's going to be tough,
the
because
reason
those are two very
they are.
distinct categories. One is really about how
Yeah.
we use monies and how we do, and then the other is about access, right? And so one is about providing the equipment, but the equipment is useless without the access. So it's kind of one, or they kind of dovetail together, but they're really two separate entities.
And they potentially would be going to separate committees, right? So if we're talking about like a utility kind of conversation, that's not going to go through House Public Education regarding digital broadband connectivity. So there would potentially be separate committees that we're addressing as well.
So I have a few questions, if I can.
Sure.
Sorry, I was a little late, but this might help our discussion. And then I'll start with the last one. If we could also have, well, first of all, great job as usual, Deb.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're always so thorough, and help us to form good, or make good judgment in what we need to do. So if we could also have in any of the proposed priorities, if there's any financial impacts to those. So I think that would kind of help decide, okay, what do we want to try to put our, weight behind,
Right.
based on the probability of it being passed, due to any financial impacts.
You want the fiscal note
Yes.
on the bill.
Yes.
Speaking our language, I know what you're seeking. For
And
that first one, though, I'm just going to be honest, Mrs. Williams. I'm not going to be able to bring you an estimated fiscal impact on what the state needs to do to increase high-speed broadband in rural and urban areas. That is outside my expertise as well, and I don't know that we, even as a state, even who to go to for that kind of analysis yet. I know the city of San Antonio is working on this priority. I know the county is working on this priority. But how I could provide you a fiscal impact for that first bullet,
You can't.
I'm at a loss.
Yeah, you can't. The state doesn't even know, Ms. Williams. I mean, the discussions I'm having at the state level, nobody really knows the price tag. What I think there's general consensus around is the idea of, to what Mr. Leos was saying, is bringing providers, the ISPs, to the table to talk about providing an infrastructure and then kind of tiering.
right, and I
how-
think that
how
might
you
be
pay.
how an estimate could possibly occur. I know there are broadband organizations that have those service providers as members of those organizations. So I just wanted to bring that up. And then early on in your presentation that I kind of came in on the middle of, the 2019 priorities, and I mean, you don't have to address it now.
Okay.
But if there's a status of what we proposed in the past, and what happened, to those, did they move forward, or what was the result, I guess?
Yeah, so those items with the blue check mark, I feel that we made progress toward. Maybe not absolutely everything we needed, as I mentioned with House Bill 3, but definitely we as a system have made changes to funding schools that reflect more of the diverse needs of our students. Those two other bullets there as example that are not check marked, we didn't make progress on, but I also don't know that there's appetite for them. Meaning that House Bill 3 did make some changes to recapture, but at some point as a state, we're going to have to come back and re-examine it, certainly push recapture down the road, but we probably will find ourselves in a similar situation in 10 to 15 years. On accountability, those two we accomplished. I'd say we were successful in that agenda. We still don't have the accountability system that we as a state want and deserve, so there's still more work to do on that. This one regarding local control, again, there are some things that we did make some gains on, but we didn't finish the work.
Okay. And then lastly, and again, this one, we can look at information later. Are there current bills or language recommendations for any of the proposed priorities? Because, I always like to attach something. If there's a bill that's already there or being considered, we can, add something to, besides House Bill 3, because we know that deals mostly with the financial aspect.
Yes, bill filing for this session will begin November 9th, but we can always look back at what was filed in previous sessions. I did speak to Diego Bernal's office about a digital-related bill about broadband providers, and I know his office is working on that and working on some language that would allow municipalities to be more involved in that delivery of the dark fiber, sort of what City of San Antonio is trying to pilot, but doing it at a broader scale. They're not, my impression from his staff is that they're still working on that, and it's not done yet, but I certainly do think that there is some way to learn from the past, as you mentioned, of bills that were filed before.
And then lastly, I appreciate you taking note on the diversity priority. I really do. What I like to know internally is how do we as a district compare to the state level data?
So again, Ms. Williams, we've looked at this, and part of this, when Deb and I visited about this presentation, when it comes to African American representation in our teaching population, we're pretty good compared to our population currently. It's really it mirrors the state. It's Hispanics. We are not. We still have an imbalance between Anglos and Hispanic educators, and so that's why Dr. Newman has been working with Mr. Trevino in HR, because we're starting to recruit differently and going to different colleges to try to find out. But again, some of it is we need some help in really getting people attracted to the profession. And I think that's through House Bill 3, things like, Deb's talking about pausing allotments and things, but I think that's what the state was trying to do through the teacher incentive allotment, is trying to say, hey, look, you can actually make more money, and thinking more people would come to the profession. But that's something that we still have work to do.
And there is a mechanism
Another
for it.
lastly?
Yeah, there's another lastly. There is a mechanism for that too at the state level. There are grow your own grants that TEA has put out, and part of those grant requirements have been that who you are recruiting for these programs mirror your student population. How are you going to set measurements to ensure that? So there certainly is mechanisms in place if the state wants to put some more emphasis behind it.
Not to change the subject, but there is, on this third one about encourage state policy and programs that address trauma-informed, we talk about child wellness. Can we add teacher wellness to that also? I think we as a district have kind of set the bar for a lot of other districts with our teacher wellness programs, but I'd love to see that encouraged at a state level to where this is kind of a joke, or maybe they'd help fund it, but because unfunded mandates are. But I'd like to bring awareness to that too. I think we're seeing a huge impact on our teachers' emotional stress right now, like nothing we've ever seen before.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to put a spotlight on that.
Would you be open to saying adult to ensure that we're also taking care of our
That's
principals?
probably an even better
Okay.
term. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And then just as a side note, the issue that I told y'all about last week with the SBOE and the framework, we did have a meeting on that Friday with the legislative committee, and there is concern that it may cause some unfunded mandates, but TASB is working on that. We do think it may be picked up at a state level, at a legislative level, because it is kind of, at this point, we're hoping to turn that tide a little bit, but the focus is on more training for school boards. So the list is already quite long, but there is talk of more mandatory, the XG thing, it's kind of and LSG, the Lone Star Governance, all of those programs, there is discussion of making those mandatory. So, but we're working on it. So I don't know how we could get that into our, speaking of the legislative priorities, I like your idea of keeping them minimal, but maybe we could say something like we support the TASB cornerstones and priorities, but I wonder if we could have almost like a secondary list of things that we as a district want to focus on, like the teacher training and the working on those. I wonder if the state is going to, in this session, as we become more aware and cognizant of diversity or sensitivity training, if that will become a mandatory thing for school boards and for districts to have training along those lines, or mandatory committees, or.
Yeah, I think it's just, and we didn't say this at the beginning, but keep in mind, this legislative session, I'd really encourage y'all to really think about which ones are your top, because remember, they got to tackle a $4.6 billion deficit, and then they have redistricting. So those two things in of itself are going to be huge, right? So how much they're going to dedicate, especially, and I think Deb and I have talked about this a lot, in a lot of the legislators' minds, they think they've addressed education, right? House Bill 3 is done, and we've done it. We did Senate Bill 11, and we're good. We're done. So how do we take back to them a few really key things to say, look, you really need to address this stuff during this session? Like, we're not going to give you 12. We're going to give you 3 or 4. Like, these are passionate. And yes, are we going to piggyback on some things? And, they'll call Deb and what's our position on it? What do you think? Do you support it? But, if we're allowed, right, to the Capitol and we get in to talk to legislators, what are those key things we want to talk about? That's what to me, I would recommend, like, really get in y'all's heads. Like, what are you passionate about? So that when we walk in, that passion comes out to that person, and that we keep that kind of on there.
I want to pause accountability. I kind of like that one, the recal.
That's been a huge discussion. I think Jerry and I heard that
Now, okay, so
in the delegate assembly, yeah.
So by pausing accountability, let's explain this, right? Deb, do you want to explain
and
what we mean by that?
I would prefer to
Let
have you do that.
Let me do it?
Yes.
That's good, Deb. So remember this. And Commissioner Morath, I think the last time, Deb, didn't you share the
Yes.
4 boxes, right,
Yes, at
that
our
they can
October
do?
meeting.
We're not against administering
Right.
the STAR, right?
Right.
Because we have to. Remember that accountability, or STAR, is really based around this idea of growth, right? And so what it says is year after year, you have to take the same assessment for me to gauge your growth. Well, now we have a gap year. And again, so with this year that we don't have in, their metrics, and if you'll remember, I'm a closet researcher, right? And I like all that stuff, is that you just can't skip a year and say, well, I can gauge your growth now. Not off of the way that they built it. So to your point, Mrs. Groner, right? It's pausing accountability. We're not going to rate a campus. We're not going to rate a district. We still need to evaluate kids and get a new benchmark, because everything that they have produced, in my opinion now, isn't worth much because you have a gap year. It's off course. So they need to recalibrate and figure out, get a new benchmark and set that and move from there, rather than saying, oh, well, we can just skip this year. And, I was on a call on Friday, and they talked about when Katrina hit, it took kids 4 years to catch up. 4. That's huge, right? So with this pandemic, I don't know that they're exactly the same. This could be even longer.
Dr. Micah, you have mentioned in the past, and I have used this phrase over and over again because I think it's so poignant, is use the data as a flashlight, not as a hammer. And so in pausing accountability and recalibrating, I hope that they would understand that, as you said, we're not telling it to go away. They just need to restructure how they receive the data and not penalize districts
Or kids.
Not penalize kids and communities, because if a child is penalized, it spreads. It's not just that child. It goes into its home and its self-confidence. I mean, just so many things can happen. Use it as a flashlight. Help us to get better. Recreate what education should look like, knowing what we've been through the last forever. This year seems like forever. And so I just hope that I agree with you, Shannon. I do like pause accountability. I do want it to be understood that we're not saying we want it to go away. It just needs to be, the data needs to be used differently. I don't know how to word that, but I'm certain you will find the eloquent words and the language.
And there may be a real appetite for that, because remember, I believe, Dr. Newman, was it the start of this year or just after the year began when Governor Abbott said 5th and 8th grade is not going to be SSI? It
I
doesn't.
believe it was right at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, see, so he said, we're not going to punish kids at the 5th and the 8th grade. So doing that so early, you know, there could be a real appetite for this one.
Okay.
Well, and I can't imagine it would cost anything.
Not like broadband. Does anybody else have anything that they're really passionate about that they?
I just have one quick question, though, and this is just to Dr. Micah and to Deb. And have y'all heard anything on whether we will be able to go testify? I got a report this weekend that they are definitely looking at closing the Capitol and not letting anyone come.
Yeah,
testify.
the latest news that I heard
Or
was
advocate.
from the Senate. Of course, remember, the House is a little bit of a precarious situation because they don't have a speaker to lead the discussions of how this would look. But if you take sort of note from the Senate, it seems like the news coming out is that they would continue to have testimony virtually. They've started to do that. We saw the Senate Education Committee take testimony virtually so that the members would be in person, but testimony and public input and the public process would be virtually. From what my understanding is, there is not a mechanism for the members not to be in person. In other words, there's an expectation that members are there. At least that's what I am understanding.
That's because they need broadband.
That's right. That's right. And if you've ever gotten on the Capitol Wi-Fi system while you're in there,
You can't get it in the basement.
you can't
Not
get in the
at all.
basement. Not at all. No, ma'am. So, from what I'm feeling is that it will be closed except for to members and staff, and that public testimony could potentially be virtual. At least that's the preliminary word coming out. I think we're going to have lots of versions change between now and Memorial Day.
That's kind of word I'd heard too.
It's just going to depend on
Yeah,
what's
the numbers.
happening at that time of the year.
It just seems like when it's so critical for us to be there that it just, I understand if they have to, I get it, I understand it. It's just when the need is so great.
Mr. Byer, you look like you're wanting to
I
say
had
something.
one thing I wanted to add, if we can, and it's related. I don't know if it's maybe a combination of the two, but we had the bullet point about diverting public tax dollars and the expansion of charters. And I know those are two kind of separate things, but maybe somewhat related, to where we can focus on something related to accountability, transparency, or something related to that whole system of what happens to my tax dollars and how it follows kids, and that we're able to kind of control that a little bit.
Well, and one of the ones that I'd written down also was the local control, the charter application. So I don't know if
Correct.
there's
And
a
I know
way
we supported that through the TASB resolution and that kind of thing. And I think that's, knowing it's a very crowded legislative agenda, you know, we'll have to see which ones have legs that we can kind of tack on to, but, you know, something to add.
Yeah, I mean, I know I would be in favor of that too, and I didn't know if that was something, you know, relevant since it was on a previous year's priority list. But, you know, I don't know, I think, and maybe charters are required to do this. I got to say, I really don't know because I haven't looked personally, but I know like a lot of public entities, this district, you know, City of San Antonio, on the Texas Comptroller's website, they're required to post, you know, how much they have in outstanding debt and various fiscal transparency metrics that they're required to post. I don't know if that's required of charters, you know. I don't know that people really get that when charters issue bonds, they're insured by the permanent school fund, or at least they can be. I don't know if people get that if there's something they don't like, that, you know, who do you go to? I mean, they elect us, but, you know, they don't get that they don't elect those representatives that serve on the boards of charters. I don't know that they get that if, you know, a charter were ever to default, you know, their tax dollars via the permanent school fund would go to insure those bonds. And again, what recourse does a taxpayer have? I don't know that they get a lot of that. And so just, you know, some of those issues of transparency, maybe mandatory, yeah. You know, bringing it out, what is your economically disadvantaged population relative to your closest traditional institution? Or how much special ed, what's all the demographics that maybe we're required to produce, are they required? If not, that would be helpful.
Yeah, charters are certainly reporting some information. I mean, they have to participate in the school first process. But I don't think Mr. Moy is here, but Dan might be able to chime in. I think their first process is different than our first process. It's not the exact same indicators, but they are part of that financial integrity rating system of Texas. That's what FIRST stands for. Are y'all impressed at all that I knew that? Can I get
Deb, you know
can I get some love
everything.
here? Because I wasn't sure that I knew it until it started coming out of my mouth.
That's as impressive as Mr. Clary being part of the heating, air conditioning, and ventilation organization that he's,
Yes.
yeah, whatever that is.
So they certainly are, and they're also reporting information through PEMS, like student demographic information. So there is certainly some level of transparency. But to your point about where their boards are located, some of the information on the comptroller's website I'm not as familiar with. The fact that the PSF is backing bonds, that may not be as well known. I think if you look at this priority, it's when you talk about improving transparency and notice requirements, we can take out some of the specific language of including and just leave it at that, improve transparency. And that impact analysis, I think, what you're describing of in comparison to the local school district, what those student demographics look like, I think that certainly can be part of an impact analysis. It doesn't have to be just strictly a financial impact. I think if you took this priority and made it more generic, I think it could pull in some of the things that Mr. Hasso is bringing up.
Okay. So to summarize, it looked like we had the high-speed broadband and the one-to-one device, right? And then the pausing accountability. And was there the mental health thing? And then the local control charter application. So is that accounting
Actually,
5 or 6?
Terry added diversity.
Oh, yeah, and then
Yes.
the diversity. So were we going to bring this at the November meeting? I'm
Yes.
looking for Peggy, yes.
That was the plan.
Uh-huh, okay. So,
Can I just recap to make sure that I have
Yes,
them
please.
correct? So all of the COVID-19 ones that are on the screen, and then we're going to add the adult wellness piece to this. I'll work with Dr. Micah if we need to massage those first 2 bullets. The pausing the accountability one, the teacher diversity, and then taking that local control priority and zooming out a little bit to be broader. Okay.
now let me ask you this. Is it possible that when you bring those back in November, we could massage them even more if we need to?
Yeah, like for example, when you sometimes do a policy reading, you might say as amended or as corrected.
Okay.
I think, I certainly would defer to Rick and Peggy on that, but I think you could make some live changes there and then adopt
Okay.
it as amended.
Okay, perfect. All right, does anybody else have anything? Okay, Deb, great job. Thank
Great
you
job.
for
Thank you.
bringing all of this. And